Again, my name is Crystal Hickman, and this presentation is called The ABCs of Native Bees, that I thought was pretty clever. Just to start out, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about myself, how I got into bees, different relationships with bees, different symbiotic relationships, like the relationships with plants, also how to identify bees a little bit, and then I'm going to end it with photography. So you can take pictures with your cell phone, with your camera, whatever. But yeah. All right. So just a little bit about me. I'm primarily three things. So I'm an artist. So you can see me creating some artwork with sugar right here. This is a motorcycle. Also a photographer. There is a bee under there, which I'm photographing a ground nesting bee, and I'm a speaker, which you can obviously tell from today. All right, so regarding my artwork, I work with primarily ballpoint pen or sugar. So these three pieces, the two on the left and the lower right-hand corner are ballpoint pen. The upper right is sugar. So I actually worked as an artist exclusively for like 10 years. And I was primarily drawing just based off of other people's photos, but then I decided to combine my artwork with my budgeting bee photography career and get like a camera where I can actually start taking original photos. I took is this is my friend Shamel Bell. She's one of the founding or original members of Black Lives Matter, but she came over to my apartment and posed, and I made that poster for her. Yeah. And then as far as speaking, I do a lot of speaking events. But yeah, I've done a TED Talk, and I speak with CNPS. I've done a couple times, and a lot of different garden and colleges, just a lot of different places. As far as my photography, what I primarily do now is I photograph bees. I photograph the plants that they visit, as well as their different ecosystems. And I go to a lot of different places. This is California, but I also go out of the country. This is clearly not California. This is actually Belize. I went there to photograph a crepuscular bee, or dusk dawn flying bee. So I'm called a community scientist. And what is a community scientist? It's an amateur scientist who conducts scientific research in a field that they don't hold a degree in. A lot of times people call that a citizen scientist, but they're basically the same thing. But just because of words changing, evolving, the word citizen now doesn't necessarily mean to a lot of, especially English speaking people in the US, that it's someone who doesn't hold a degree. It means whether or not someone has papers or whether or not they're documented. So community scientist is like an inclusive title that a lot of English speaking people in the US like to use, just to make, again, people feel more inclusive. So what I do is I photograph bees in their environments. I document their behavior, notate the plants that they're present on, and I also keep track of things like times, dates, and weather. I actually have an Excel sheet that I keep for every single location I visit. I update it every single year just to see what's changing. So how I got started, I don't know if anyone's seen this quote before, but if the bee disappeared off the surface of the globe, then man would only have 4 years of life left. No more bees, no more pollination, no more plants, no more animals, no more man. That quote's attributed to Albert Einstein. So I actually saw this on Facebook, and just like pretty much everyone who read it there, I also thought it was true. Turns out this quote actually isn't true. I spent a long time believing it was, and actually also thought Albert Einstein said it. He actually never did. This quote was made up in the 90s. So I don't know if you guys are all at all familiar about when Einstein was alive, but he passed away, I think, in the 50s. So this was a little while after then. But yeah, I read this. I thought it was true. And I was like, I want to go out there and help these creatures because bees are everywhere. And I feel like I really need to help them. So I took pictures of bees. And when I say bees, I mean honeybees, because that's what I thought that this quote was about. So I was taking these pictures with my cell phone of just a lot of honeybees. So just honeybees. Yeah, a lot of honeybee pictures. And then I took this photo. And it's clearly a bee, but it's not a honeybee. And I was like, okay, what is this? So I went back to the people who at the time I thought were bee experts, which were beekeepers, and asked them, and they didn't know. So of all places, I went back to Facebook and I ended up finding a group dedicated to native bees that was full of entomologists, which are people who work with insects, as well as militologists, which are people who specialize with bees. And they told me pretty quickly that this is a native bee, unlike honeybees, which are actually not native to here, and that it was a female andrina. And one thing they also mentioned to me too was that it was actually native bees that were potentially threatened or endangered, not honeybees. So a lot of times when people say save the bees, they actually apply that to just honeybees, or they try to apply it to all bees. But saying save the bees and just talking about honeybees is like saying save the birds, and then you're talking about a chicken. So I would say like honeybees are kind of like the chickens of the bee world. But yeah, anyway, I ended up going back out because this kind of like changed my whole mindset on bees. And I was like, okay, I'm going to find these native bees. I want to help them. And I kept going to the places where I'd seen all of those honeybees before. And for whatever reason, I just wasn't finding them. Like I was spending months just going out there and just was not finding them. And I had absolutely no idea why. And that was until the Crescent Farm, again, Facebook, reoccurring theme here. They posted about 5 pictures of bees that the horticulturalist there, John, had seen in a day, I think. And I was like, wow, this is really weird. Why are there so many native bees here? So then, of course, I had to go to the Crescent Farm. And by the way, the Crescent Farm is about an acre. It's at the LA Arboretum, and it's just native plants. So the first day I was there, I actually took these photos. So a little bit about these bees. They're all native bees. This is a Megachile agilis. This is the male Megachile agilis, and this is also another one too, just different color forms. There's also a halictus bee, which is a sweat bee, as well as a Lasioglossum dialictus, which is also a sweat bee. But yeah, I photographed these all in the same day. And just after being there, I was like, okay, why are there so many native bees here? And it turns out that it was the native plants. So this is a California Native Plant Society. I don't have to go over this with you guys, but just in case, because there might be some new people here, what is a native plant? A plant is considered native if it has occurred naturally in the particular region, ecosystem, or habitat without human introduction. So what that means, plants can be native to the entire United States. They can be native just to California. Some of them can be native to just your zip code. And the same thing applies with bees. Again, entire United States, just California, or just your zip code. So native bees and native plants. Native plants can potentially have symbiotic relationships with native fauna. So save the native bees also means save the native plants, and vice versa. So saving native plants helps save many more pollinators than just native bees. It also helps birds, butterflies, bats, wasps, so many creatures. And then also too, I want to get the differences between honeybees and native bees, because I feel like a lot of times people get confused on this, and I just kind of want to lay out like the basics here. So first off, honeybees, they're not threatened or endangered. Native bees are potentially threatened or endangered. The number that's actually threatened or endangered, it kind of varies depending on who you talk to, but I've heard either 1 in 4 or 1 in 6. Honeybees, the ones that are in the United States, those are from Europe. Native bees, again, like native plants, they're from where they currently reside. Honeybees drink water provided by people. Native bees get their hydration from plants. So I know a lot of times people are like, oh, I want to put out a water dish for the bees in my native garden. But if you're doing that, you're actually attracting honeybees, not native bees. Yeah, and then honeybees are also generalist pollinators. So a lot of times people think this is great because that means, hey, they'll pollinate everything. But since they don't have those symbiotic relationships, they don't actually pollinate anything all that well. It's been said that honeybees have about a 5% pollination rate, so it's pretty low. Native bees can also be generalist pollinators, but they can also be specialist pollinators, meaning they will sometimes pollinate just one family of plants, sometimes one genus, sometimes even one species. And honeybees are also detrimental to native bees. So that's in a couple of ways. They'll actually outcompete native bees for resources. And then also they're known to spread deformed wing virus to bumblebees. So the way that happens is honeybees get deformed wing virus from a European mite called a varroa mite. And what it does is it actually latches onto the developing young and makes their wings small. But some honeybees are actually carriers, but they're not physically affected. So the ones that are carriers, they're actually fly out around to different flowers and they'll actually infect the pollen. Bumblebees will visit those same plants, and baby bees or developing bees actually consume pollen. So they'll take that pollen back to their hive or their nest. And then we're starting to see bumblebees with smaller wings. Yeah. And then I guess one way that's really helpful to stop that, besides introducing honeybees, is actually introducing more native plants. So that's why I always encourage more people to put more native plants in their yard, because diversity really helps decrease that. And I'll get into this a little bit later, but native bees are also threatened by climate change. Honeybees live in colonies, or they're eusocial. Native bees, about 70% are ground nesting, 30% are cavity nesting, and 90% are solitary. So they live by themselves for the most part. All right, so specialist pollinators. I love to talk about this one because this is my very first specialist pollinator. It's called a Perdita nisuta. And this is also my very first contribution to community science. So at the time, I was actually out with a friend. So me and my friends also have the only photos of living representatives of these bees. So any other photos you see besides the two of us, they're all specimens from a museum. But what's really cool about this bee, so this is a female. You can tell she's a female because she has pollen. But this male has this little facial feature called a clypeus, or it kind of looks like a duckbill. I've been calling them duck face bees, but that's not what they're called. But no one knew what that facial feature was for. And because I was going out there and just photographing them and looking at them alive, I was actually able to observe it. So within, I think, about 10 minutes of me being there, I actually saw the male using the facial feature. So what he's actually doing is he's grasping the female's antennae on either side of that little clypeus facial feature to stop her from flying off so he can attempt to mate with her. And the reason I was able to make this observation, opposed to a lot of other militologists who have seen this bee before, is because the way they're observing bees is not alive. So a lot of times what they'll do is they'll put out pan traps that have like a liquid in there, like maybe like antifreeze or something that will preserve the bodies. The insects will get attracted to it, they'll fly in, and then they'll pass away. So what people are looking at are deceased specimens a lot of the time, opposed to live ones. So, and this is an observation anyone can make. You don't have to go out there with like a nice camera. You can just go out with your cell phone. You can even make observations like this in your backyard. But yeah, I was really proud of this. But one thing that's also really cool about this buckwheat, this was in Death Valley, but you'll see it in like Joshua Tree as well. So this buckwheat is yellow, and pretty much everything that I actually saw on it was the similar color of like yellow or like a red that sort of like matched the flower of the plant. And I don't know if this is true, but it really seems like there are a lot of other creatures that might have symbiotic relationships with this plant as well, like they evolved together. And what's also really interesting about this too, I think it's important to note that these creatures could all disappear and it won't negatively or positively impact people at all. And I just feel like these creatures being here is an important enough reason to value them and try to conserve the areas where they live, because I don't think nature should be valued in relation to people. I think it should just be valued because it exists. But yeah, with that said, here's another specialist pollinator. This one's really cool too. This is called a Calliopsis pullae. And pretty much whenever you see photos of this bee, it's on a desert dandelion. And one of the ways you can actually ID this bee to species is because of the flower that it's on. And that's how I was actually able to ID this one. And it was also the first bee that I ever actually looked for by looking for the flower. So I just think that's really cool. So you can look for bees by looking for the flower. So that's what happened again with this one. So this is called a Perdita minima. It's the smallest known bee in North America, potentially the world. And if you actually look at the quarter here in the lower left-hand corner, you see the flowers on the quarter. That's what the bees are on. So these bees are a little bit less than or equal to 2 millimeters, so about the size of a letter on a quarter. And you can tell this is the female again because she has pollen, and this is the male. Males don't carry pollen. And then what's also really nice about this too is like just ecosystems can be really small, especially in the desert. A lot of things are really, really tiny. This is the smallest Lasioglossum dialectus I've ever seen. It's also known as a bee that's really, really hard to ID to species. But because of cameras getting like so much better, I was actually able to take a couple of photos of this bee and get it ID'd to species. So before, this was known as a bee that you have to collect and take to a lab and look at under a microscope. But this one, she clearly has pollen, so she has brood that she's taking care of. So she got to go on and live her life. But what's also really cool about the sand mat is ecosystems can be really small. Like a lot of times people will think of an entire like forest or a desert, but this sand mat was like 2 feet by 2 feet squared, and all of these creatures lived on it. So not only was it potentially the smallest bee in the world, there's also this mite on it as well. So this is called a Paratarsodomus macropalpus, and it's the fastest land animal on Earth relative to its size. So if it was the size of a human, it'd run about 1,300 miles an hour. But yeah, this mite is really small. It's like 0.5 to 0.7 millimeters, and it's like not completely in focus because it was running. But yeah, I just think it's really cool that like just this was on a neighborhood sidewalk, that just really tiny ecosystems. But yeah, I made a little video about this, which I want to show you guys. So hopefully this plays. So So this wasp is about 1.7 millimeters. There's a carpenter ant looking very huge. And there's the Perdita minima. So what's really cool about this bee is they do a tripod stance where they stand up on their back legs. So they actually collect pollen on their chest. And then when they've basically filled up the area on their chest, they moisten it with their middle legs and their mouth parts, and they pack it on their back legs. And there's the little thrips there as well, just for size reference. Okay, so also symbiotic relationships don't just exist in the bee world. They exist in the wasp world as well. So this is a wasp that you'll actually see on a California brittle bush, and it's also ID'd because it's on a California brittle bush. So I think that's very cool. But it's not also just in the insect world. I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen Finding Nemo, or watched it over and over with your kids or grandkids like millions of times. But so yeah, this is a sea anemone and a clownfish. So the sea anemone gets food because the clownfish attracts a lot of food to it. The clownfish gets protection from the sea anemone, gets protection by the sea anemone because it has a coating on its flesh, so other creatures can't come and attack it or eat it. But also symbiotic relationships can be impacted by climate change. And I feel like this is one that pretty much everyone's really familiar with. So in 2019, 2020, there was a large oceanic temperature gradient, which happens like pretty much every year or every year. But because of climate change, it was really exacerbated. So what happened was Australia got an intense drought, Eastern Africa got very, very intense floods, which wasn't on the news a lot. But basically, how it impacted this relationship in Australia is because of the drought, everything was super dry and there were a lot of fires. So what happened was a lot of the eucalyptus that koalas eat exclusively was actually burnt up. So the koalas that survived the fire, a lot of them actually started starving. And I bring this example up because this is something that's happening not just with like koala and eucalyptus leaves, it's also happening with bees in our different ecosystems that are close to us. But because a lot of times people don't like bees or because people don't think they're as cute and fluffy, they're not really doing anything to help or save them. So what can we do? There's a lot of things we can do, but I think the two big things are one, document to raise awareness. So again, you could be a community scientist in your own backyard. There's also iNaturalist that you can use, but also plant native plants in our yards. I think that's really helpful. So I'm sure you guys are all familiar with iNaturalist, but if you're not, definitely check it out on the website. There's a website version and there's also a phone version. I created 2 bee projects, which you can actually see in the lower right-hand corner here. Both of these exclude honeybees because I feel like just everyone puts in honeybees when they're doing bee IDs. So these are just for native bees. So there's one for California and Los Angeles obviously wouldn't apply to you guys as much, but there's also one exclusively for Los Angeles. And this garden, I think, is amazing. So this is an example, again, of community science. This is Arlington Garden in Pasadena. It's a local free garden that anyone can visit like 24/7. And I like to bring this garden up because at one point I was the only person in this garden looking for bees. And this is a male Xylocopa sonorina. And I have not seen this bee still since 2018 in the garden. And I actually thought it had no longer been there. But in 2021, Arlington Garden started doing nature walks and bio blitzes. And the very first day, someone got this photo of this bee flying by. And I think this is just a really great example of what could potentially happen. Like there's a lot of area to look at for not just bees, but for plants, for all different organisms. And if there's very few people looking, there's a lot of things that we might miss. So I think that's why it's really great to get into community science. Santa Monica Mountains, one of my favorite places to visit. I bring this one up because a lot of times you can actually time bees with the flowers. So if you're looking at morning glories, if you see those out, then these are some bees that will actually be out at the same time. This is called a Diadacia bituberculata, which is a ground nesting bee. A lot of times you'll see them with little turrets or chimneys that they use around their burrows. Male and female, keeping the population going. So this is a female constructing her turret. So she does this so parasitic bees are less likely to get in, parasitic bees, flies, wasps, things like that. And this is a photo of her actually sleeping in the burrow with her little legs sticking out. I'm not sure why some of them do this. Like maybe they can't fit all the way down, but it makes for really cute photos. And so I didn't actually take this video, but my friend did. So this was at Mishimoka Trailhead, a parking lot, and this is the largest aggregation I've ever seen. There's about 100,000 bees here. And what's really cool about native bees is they very rarely sting. So I spent quite a bit of time with this aggregation, and you could walk amongst them and you just do not get stung. But yeah, my friend's making a documentary about these, and I think they're so cool. I'm gonna skip the rest of the video. Okay, so some other bees that actually show up at the same time as the morning glories are longhorn bees. This one is a Eucera. You can tell this is a Eucera bee because he has black antennae as well as black eyes, where Melisotis have lighter colored eyes. Typically, there is one that has darker eyes, but they also have bicolored antennae. And this is a Euphoria. A lot of times you can actually ID them to species again by the flower that they're in. But yeah, this is one sleeping in the morning glory. Some other flowers, deerweed and Asteraceae or sunflowers, asters. When those are out, these are some bees that you'll see. So these top two are Anthophora. This is an Anthophora edwardsii. It's a very early spring bee, as well as the Anthophora crotchii. You could tell these males from females. So the female has the plumose hair or the branched hair on the back leg. Male doesn't, because he doesn't collect pollen. Also, male has the clippiest facial feature, kind of like the duck face male that we saw before, but the females have hair on their face. He also has a little fan on his middle leg that he uses to, I think, either cover the eyes of the female when he's mating with her or like stroke her antennae, one of those. But then another bee that looks almost exactly like the Anthophora is a Habercoda. Again, you could tell this is a male because he has the clippiest facial feature. This is a Hoplitis. So she doesn't actually carry pollen on her back leg. She carries it on the underside of her abdomen. Some other bees that are present. This is a Brachymolectica californica, which is a parasitic bee. Also made a really cool community science observation with this one. I was looking at the California brittle bush that a bunch of them were on one time, and I didn't realize it was them because they looked like bird poop. So there are some bees that look like bird poop, and this is one of them. This is a male Megachile. This is another female Hoplitis. You can see the pollen on the underside of her abdomen. This is a male Osmia. Male Osmias usually have like some of them have a lot of facial hair. They could have just like a little mustache, or this guy has like basically a mullet all the way down his back, but they also have longer antennae too. So climate change close to home. Santa Monica Mountains, again, I was saying like, it's one of my favorite places to visit. And this was, I think, July of 2 years ago. And I bring this area up again just because it's a beautiful biodiverse ecosystem. Normally it's not this brown, but because it's so beautiful, a lot of people have been moving there. And because a lot of people have been moving there, they've been concerned about fires, and fires also have been increasing. So people who lived in the area actually asked a certain conservancy to go through and remove some native plants. And this was actually an area that I'd been visiting for, I think, 5 or 6 months at this time. And 4th of July weekend, they were concerned about fireworks. So they actually went through the entire mountain ranges and just bulldozed or went through with a tractor and cut down all of the native plants. And this is a very, very small area. And the reason I bring it up is because I literally spent so much time here, and I photographed over 40 species of bees. And these are some of the bees that I actually photographed at this spot. So what's really interesting about this is after they went through with the tractor, I haven't seen a single native bee. I ended up going back last year because I was thinking like, oh, maybe some of the plants will grow back. I did start to see them grow back a little bit, but then they came through with a tractor again. So it might be an area that will potentially be void of bees permanently unless they stop going through with the tractor. Yeah, so this is a map that I like to show everyone because I feel like a lot of times people don't know we have a lot of biodiversity here, but they don't really know why. If you look in California, it's just deep red. So this is an area with high biodiversity. And this map is actually really great because it actually showcases a lot of creatures that normally are left off of analysis for biodiversity, like bees, butterflies, fish, mussels, crayfish, a lot of flowering plants. And I guess one thing too that's really good to take note of, hopefully this happens. So only 13% of the US right now is currently protected. The Biden administration is doing a 30 by 30 initiative where they want to move that up to 30% of the US by 2030. So hopefully that happens. But the reason why we are such a biodiverse ecosystem in California is because we're a Mediterranean ecosystem. So a lot of times, if you look at, I'm sure you're familiar with gardening books, they always talk about like summer rains. When we're the opposite, we have winter rains. So Mediterranean ecosystems have the winter rains. They're also typically on the western side of continents, next to a cold, large body of water. And there's typically like mountain ranges and a desert on the eastern side. So all of these green areas highlighted are Mediterranean areas. And Mediterranean areas also take up about 2% of land on Earth. And I think they have about 20% of Earth's biodiversity. So crazy amount of biodiversity. That also translates to bees as well. In the US, there's a little over 4,000 species of bees. And in California alone, we have about 1,600. So a lot of biodiversity here. And this just kind of goes into summer rainfall, which is pretty much everywhere else in the world. Winter rainfall is what we have, opposed to maybe this year when we seem to have rainfall about every month, but we'll see. So one thing that's really cool that the Santa Monica Mountains is doing is they're starting to actually value land for the purpose of land, like the conservation. So they're starting to see nature has an inherent value of not necessarily what it can do for people, but just the fact that it exists is a reason to preserve it. So I'm really hopeful that the Santa Monica Mountains, basically when anyone wants to develop there now, they have to actually talk to the Conservancy and get their permission for about basically like what they're going to destroy. So I really hope this means that less of the Santa Monica Mountains will be developed. And I also hope this means they'll stop like going through with a tractor and bulldozer. I'm not too sure if that's going to happen because the Conservancy is also the same organization that are the ones that are going through with the tractors. So we'll see what happens. So San Gabriel Mountains, this is really cool. So this is an Anthophora bomboides, and these bees nest on the side of cliffs or mountains. And I'm going to mute this because it's my friend talking here, but he filmed the aggregation. And the way I actually got those photos is we actually hiked this mountain with a ladder, and I climbed up the side of the ladder and I took photos up there. But yeah, I just think this is really, really cool seeing like these are all solitary bees, but just like the Diadacia, they live in groups. So it's kind of like living in a neighborhood. You each have your own house, but you live close together. So again, solitary, but solitary in an aggregation. Yeah, and there's a bunch of them flying around there. Also, Trinity Alps. So I went to the Trinity Alps 2 years ago to photograph a bee that hasn't been seen since 2006, which is a Bombus franklini. It's one of the 4 endangered bumblebees in California. Actually had a 10-day trip up there, which was really, really intense. It was only like a 9-mile hike, and I thought I was in really great shape, but 9 miles took me, I was one of the slower people, 9 hours. It was ridiculous. But yeah, we were really hopeful that we would find this bumblebee that had not been seen. This is it. It's called the Bombus franklini, and Robin Thorpe, who's since passed away, but he was just like this great bumblebee guy. We were really, really hopeful that we would find it. Didn't end up finding it, but I did find this bee. So this is Elaseoglossum cymbrialicus, and this is the first. I have a bunch of photos, but I have the only photos of living representatives of this bee. And this is also the only observation post 2000. It's a high elevation bee. So I'm kind of happy that I did find this one, but I'm going to the Sierras next month to try and find the Bombus franklini again. Fingers crossed that it's there, also in better shape. So maybe I'll hike a little bit faster. Went to Belize last year, specifically to find a crepuscular bee. And I had absolutely no idea how I was going to do it. So I had a hotel, like kind of like bungalow. And I was like, you know what? This is a really great idea. I hung up some clothes hangers in trees with some towels from my room. On one tree, I had a flashlight. The other one, I had a black light. I was just hoping the bee would show up because it had never been observed in this area before. Also, it was the complete wrong time of year, but I was like, this is the only time I can go with people. So let's see what happens. Within 10 minutes, the bee showed up. So I was really, really happy about that. And my friend ended up buying me like drinks that would probably cost like $20 here. They were like $2 in Belize. I got the virgin kind because I don't really drink alcohol, but like I was really proud. Anza Borrego. So you're seeing a lot of climate change impacts here. This year is definitely very different because of all of the rain, but I think this was 2 years ago. I was looking for another bee that has a symbiotic relationship with Sorothamus or smoke trees slash smoke bushes. Didn't find it, but I did find this bee, which is a Megachile brownie. And again, this is the only living the photos that I have are the only photos of living representatives of this bee. I think it's only been seen 2 or 3 times post 2000, and the other observations are in the 80s and earlier. And I wasn't sure what this bee was when I first saw it. I actually thought it was a different Megachile species, but I conferred with my friend James Hung, who's like great militologist, and he's like, hey, it's this bee that like people don't see a lot. So I was like, okay, I definitely have to go back. But there was a week gap in between my trips because I wasn't able to, I was like busy with work. And that entire week, it had been about 110 degrees the entire time. So the first time I was there, I saw a bunch of different native bees. And this is what the smoke tree is supposed to look like. This is what it looked like when I was there. So when I went back, it hit about 117 that day. And when I opened my car door, the first thing I heard was just this loud hum. And it was something that I've been hearing like a lot lately. So basically with the drought, there were less things blooming. So, excuse me. So basically what was happening was honeybees that had gotten out into the wild were like converging over anything that was blooming. And they were driving out whatever native bees were there. So I actually walked around this tree like twice. Didn't see anything about but honeybees. Like all of the native bees I'd seen before disappeared. But then just randomly, I guess this happens in the desert when it's super hot. There were clouds coming overhead and it just started raining. And when it started raining, all of the bees just disappeared. And it only rained for like 5 minutes. And then there's just the sky opened up. These are some of the clouds from that morning. And after the clouds disappeared, there was a double rainbow, which I was like, oh, really cool. So I got some shots of that. But when I went back to the bush, I saw this one lone Megachile brownie drying herself off. And that was the only Megachile brownie I saw that day. And after she dried off, the hum came back. The honeybees started coming back. And I don't know where this bee went after that, but it was just a really interesting experience. But that's an example of what is happening in nature because people are letting honeybees just get out in the wild. So native landscaping. My friend Paloma took this photo and posted it on Instagram, and I had no idea her yard looked like this. So I was like, oh my gosh, I have to come and look at your yard. So there's an approach that she uses in her yard called watershed landscaping. I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with that, but what is the watershed approach? It's basically a land area that drains into a common waterway, such as a stream, lake, estuary, wetland, aquifer, or even an ocean. It's mimicked in your yard. So you can see it in this photo. The areas with a lot of mulch are higher than the areas with the rocks. So actually things are flowing down there. So it's kind of creating a way to like trap and collect water. So there's three key principles. One, build a healthy living soil that is biologically diverse and has developed a structure like a sponge. So spongy soil can hold and release rainwater, cycling carbon, nutrients, promoting biodiversity for plant resiliency. And one thing too about biodiversity, and this doesn't just apply to soil, but like with plants or with insects, other animals, there's a lot of times things that people don't necessarily like bacteria or arthropods or like maybe fungi for some people. But to have a healthy biodiverse ecosystem, you have to have those things in there. They'll help balance each other out. And it starts with the soil. Also treat rainwater as a resource. So retention can be accomplished by creating small divots, like you see here, basins, contours. So impermeable surfaces can be made permeable or used as capture areas for redirection of water landscape. Rain barrels can also be used to store rainwater. And I think, if I remember this correctly, about an inch of rain can give you a couple 100 gallons of water. So if you are in drought years and it's just you're getting an inch of rain, that rain can actually carry you and your native landscaping through the year. Also, plant native flora. So this is Paloma's yard again. The first day I went there, I actually photographed these bees. So this is the female to the orange carpenter bee that we saw before, the Xylocopa sonorina. You can tell she's that species because she has orange tinted wings. This is an Agapostemon texanus. So it's another female. You can tell she's collecting pollen here. This is a male osmia, again, longer antennae, facial hair. This is a female Halictus farinosus, which is a brown-winged sweat bee. But yeah, what's really cool about her yard is not only does she have those other bees, she also has this bee. So this is a fairly uncommon bee called a Perdita interrupta, and it has a symbiotic relationship with two plants. One is clearly the poppy because it's on a poppy, but any bee that has a relationship with a poppy also needs to have a symbiotic relationship with another plant because poppies don't produce nectar. So you'll actually, if you do have these in your yard, you'll find the males, they spend their entire adult life on the poppies waiting for a female to show up while she's collecting pollen. They'll try and mate with her, like what's happening in this photo. But what they also have a relationship with this cryptantha too, so or popcorn plant. So that's where they get their nectar. And what's also really great about her yard is not only does she have that rare bee, she also has this bee. So this is a Bombus crouchii, which is one of the 4 endangered bumblebees in California. So this photo, I actually took it at the Crescent Farm at the LA Arboretum, but because I spent so much time in her yard, she actually went out there looking for other bees and she photographed one flying by and she was super excited about it. Also, maintaining a native environment. So you need less of these things, pesticides and herbicides. So I'm sure you already know, but pesticides kill insects that benefit plants. Herbicides kill plants that benefit insects. So these actually can impact more than just their intended target. So like, let's say with the pesticides, my friend Paloma, for whatever reason, didn't like the California poppy bee, the Perdita interrupta. So she sprayed a bunch of pesticides. So if there's nothing else to pollinate the poppies, who's going to pollinate the poppies? And let's say on the other side, she doesn't like poppies for some reason. So she sprayed a bunch of herbicides. What's going to happen to that Perdita interrupta? Where is it going to go? So a native landscape will naturally keep a healthy balance between insect and plant. So there's little to no need for pesticides and herbicides. So just to know that you have a healthy biodiverse ecosystem, there's a couple of creatures that I look for. Since I work primarily with insects, I look for insects. This is a wasp that I like to call an indicator insect. And it's an indicator insect because its life cycle relies on a creature a lot of us consider pests, which is an aphid. So again, if you have a healthy biodiverse yard, you should have aphids in your yard. But this is a really tiny wasp. So here it is actually next to a quarter. So a lot of times people don't even notice they have it in their yard. And here it is at Arlington Gardens. So they have a nice ecosystem as well. So the way this life cycle works is the females will do something called ovipositing, or they'll stick an egg into the body of an aphid. The aphid's body will swell up. It'll become like a cocoon or a mummy for the developing wasp. When the wasp is an adult and ready to emerge or reclose, they'll chew a little hole out the back of the aphid, creates population control for the aphids, and also keeps the wasp population growing. Another indicator insect is a lacewing. So these are all actually on the wasp and that I photographed before, and the lacewing, they're all in the same patch of sunflowers. So this is an egg, this is a larva, this is an adult. They'll eat aphids as well, thrips, mealybugs, a lot of different other creatures as well. But what's really cool about all of these creatures, I was talking before about how ecosystems can be small, like that 2 foot by 2 foot square sand mat. This was just a single sunflower, all of these creatures. So ecosystems can be just on a sunflower. And this is the thrips that I actually photographed on that sunflower as well. And you can tell how small they are because this is the pollen from the sunflower. So really tiny creatures. All right, so some plants that I think are great to have in your yard. Hopefully I'm good on time. But yeah, so some plants that I think are great to have in your yard are buckwheat, which you can see here. There's a lot of different kinds of buckwheat. and salvia or sage. There's a lot of different kinds of that as well. And then also asters, asteraceae, or like sunflowers. So what they will attract are, these are male longhorn bees. They're Melisotis. So you can tell they're Melisotis again because they have the bicolored antennae, the long antennae, and they have the lighter colored eyes opposed to the Eucera. So they actually will collect nectar and pollen from these, but they also use them to sleep on. So I talked about this one before, but poppies and the cryptantha, or the popcorn flower, will attract the Perdita interrupta. So if you want to attract these in your yard, plant those two flowers. What's also great too, so this would be a great community science observation. No one has ever seen a burrow of Perdita interrupta. So if you find this bee in your yard, and it might still be out now, look for burrows and get photos, videos, and you can make a really amazing contribution. So yeah, there's a male, just kind of closer. Mallows. I absolutely love mallows because you'll find a lot of sleeping bees in them. This is a female, so females don't sleep in them, but these flowers actually open and close with the sun. So before they close, you'll see a lot of male bees. I mainly see Diadacia bees, but they'll go in them, kind of tuck themselves in, go to sleep for the night. And then when the sun comes up the next day, the flowers are open, the males will come out and fly out. So this is a great flower to actually photograph a lot of bees, because a lot of them will be sleeping in here. Squash flowers as well. So this bee used to be called a Pepinapis prunosa. Now it's a Eucera Pepinapis prunosa. It's a squash bee. I have not seen an area of squash without these bees. But this is also a very early morning bee. So they actually start flying as soon as the flowers open, which I think is like sometimes before the sun even rises, like maybe like 5:30. And by noon, the flowers close and they're done. So the males, again, spend their entire adult life on the flower waiting for females, and the females nest right under the squash flower. So these are good ones to look out for. Redbud, I absolutely love redbud, or flowering trees, but redbud specifically. So you'll attract leaf cutter bees. So this is a female, so they actually cut little I guess like C slices in the leaves, and they roll them up and they use them to line their burrows. That's a female. Again, you could tell she has the plumose hair on the underside of her abdomen, but also carpenter bees. This is obviously not redbud, but I included it because it's male and female. But carpenter bees absolutely love flowering trees. So if you want to combine like flowering trees for carpenter bees and megachile or leafcutter bees, get redbud. It's a great one. Plant stems in your yard. So like I was saying before, 30% of bees are cavity nesting. So they nest in like hollow stems, for example, holes in wood. So in your yard, if you want to support habitat for these bees, leave about 12 to 18 inches of plant stems. So they like plant stems with pithy or like sort of like spongy soft centers to nest in. And this is actually the small carpenter bee. So we have 3 species of large carpenter bee. This is a really small one. And you could tell the males from the females because the male has basically the clipeus facial feature, and then he has 2 little lines on the either side, where the female just has a straight line. Also, she has the plumose hair back there for collecting pollen. So the small carpenter bees are called Ceratina. The large ones are called Xylocopa. This is my favorite grass for yards. This is the Bouteloua gracilius. And I absolutely love this one because you'll find so many creatures sleeping on it. I find a lot of like Melisotis bees, like the longhorn bees or Anthophora, sleeping on them as well. I've also seen the green bees, the male Agapostemon, sleeping on them. But it doesn't have to be just Bouteloua. Like this is, I can't remember what this is. It might be some sort of aster. But it was left at King Gillette Ranch. They didn't prune things back, and a lot of male bees were using it to sleep on. This is flax at the Crescent Farm at the LA Arboretum. 2 Anthophora urbana males were sleeping on it. This one's sleeping on grass. I know this looks like a wasp, but this is actually a nomada, which is a parasitic bee, just like the Brachymolectica californica before. So parasitic bees don't actually collect pollen. They don't even provision their own nest. They actually have a host species that they go into their burrow, normally a ground nesting burrow. They'll lay an egg. Their egg will hatch first. It'll consume the egg or the larva of the host species, and then it'll eat all the pollen that was provisioned by the host. So cuckoo bees. Penstemons attract a lot of things. I also think it's a great flower to find sleeping bees. This is Eucalyptus farinosus. He was sleeping in there. I kind of scared him when I was taking photos. So he got out on top here and posed very beautifully on the penstemon. This is another piece of grass. I think this was actually in the Trinity Alps. I don't think this one's native, but Megachile sleeping on it. Another thing too, I think this is a great hashtag, Leave the Leaves. It's from the Xerces Society, because leaves provide valuable organic matter to help build a healthy soil. They also work as weed suppression, moisture retention. And there's also a lot of creatures that overwinter under leaves, like queen bees, bumblebees, butterflies, wasps, things like that. And it's also, I think, personally better than mulch, because I know mulch is great for water retention, but if you have really thick mulch, it can actually prevent oxygen from reaching creatures that will potentially overwinter under there. So if you are going to mulch, I would say no more than like 2 to 3 inches. And then bee houses. So there's a lot of bee houses that are recommended to people. And I'm like really picky with bee houses because there's a lot of things that are just sold to people that aren't actually appropriate for bees. So if you do get a bee house, I always recommend wee bee houses, because these are houses that are designed to be clean. So like a lot of bee houses, I compare them to like a dog house. So let's say your dog lives outside 24/7 and you've never cleaned your dog house out. What happens when your dog spends a lot of time like sleeping in there? They can get really sick. So the same thing can happen with bees. So I recommend wee bee houses because you can actually take apart the cells. If you guys can see this, because I can't see myself on camera. But so the way it actually works is they have these columns that you can actually take apart and take the cocoons out. So you can actually take them out and clean them. So it comes apart pretty easily like that. And what's really nice about this is not only can you clean them, but so female bees can actually control whether or not they're laying a male or female egg. And typically they lay male eggs closer to the entrance of the burrow and females closer to the back, which is why typically male bees are smaller than female bees. They also take less time to develop. So if you do get a bee house, I always recommend getting one with a drawer at the top. So after you finish cleaning them out, you can actually put the cocoons in the drawer and the bees will emerge in the order that they're supposed to. So it helps prevent any like death potentially. So this is a product that was designed for bees that is not really appropriate for bees. So bee houses should be at least 6 inches deep. And this one's clearly not 6 inches deep. And there's also no way to clean this out. So yeah, I'd always keep in mind like what like our products actually appropriate for the creatures that will be living in them. But one thing too is if you have a native yard, you actually don't even need a bee house, because a lot of times the bees will just find areas to live in themselves. Another thing I'd say too is like a lot of times people actually buy bees along with bee houses. And they're not honeybees, they are native bees, but just again, because the bee is native to somewhere in the US doesn't necessarily mean the bee is native to where you live. So I always recommend don't purchase bees. Just create the native habitat and then the bees will come to you. Yeah. So with bee houses, this is an example of what can happen if you don't clean out your bee house. These are osmia bees. This is a male. Again, you can tell because of the facial hair, this is a female. And they also transport these mites when they're mating with each other. So bee houses can be like a vector for mites and a lot of other disease. So I went through YouTube and I found some instructional videos that I think are really helpful for cleaning out your bee house if you do have one. So definitely check out these two channels and these two videos. I would say if you have a bee house that has cells that you can't take apart, one thing that I always recommend that you do is get the paper biodegradable straws, and you can actually stick them in the cells. So when bee season's over, when you notice that the cells are capped, actually just unroll them, take them apart, clean them out from the instructions that are in these videos. And then if you have a bee house that hopefully has one of these little drawers, put them in there and they'll emerge when they're supposed to. I would leave them outside opposed to inside, because if you leave them inside, they might start to emerge earlier just because like maybe it's warmer and they think, hey, it's time to come out. Okay, and I was talking before about leaving water out for bees. Have you guys notice what kind of bee is coming to these water dishes? All of them are honeybees. So again, putting water out for bees only attracts the non-native invasive European honeybee. So yeah. However, this is a good example of what you could do if you find a down bee. So this is on my hand, not the best picture, but my friend was very scared of this carpenter bee. It was in between her window panes. She left it there for like 4 hours because she was really scared of her. So if you do find a bee that is kind of just tired, even if it's a honeybee, I would never give it honey, because again, you could spread pathogens to bees or between bees. If you know the honeybee came from your hive, then definitely could give it honey. But what I always recommend for any bee is give it a mixture of 3 parts water and 1 part sugar. That's what I did for this one. And within like, I don't know, like 5-10 minutes, she was up and like flying away. So hopefully I still have some time here. I wanted to get into, am I still good with time?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay, cool. Awesome. All right. So bee photography. A lot of times people ask me for a lot of tips. So these are my tips for photographing bees. So I created this document, I guess, for angles to photograph bees for ID, and highlighted the things that you should look for. So on the lateral view or the view from the side, look at the antennae. So you can actually tell a male from a female by looking at the antennae. So females have 12 antenna segments, males have 13. And also, if you get pretty familiar with bees, like both of these are osmia. If you notice, this male has really long antennae. They're so long, they're out of the picture. Female has shorter. Also, the head shape, you can actually tell you can identify some bees to genus by just looking at their head, because they have kind of like a ball head, like Diadacia. You can just look at their face and you know that's a Diadacia. The legs help you tell like males from females for some species. If you see a lot of plumose hair on the back leg, you know that's a female. It also helps you narrow down to the family. If you know it's a female, but you don't see that plumose hair, that also helps you. This is called a turgula. It's kind of like a shoulder joint that attaches the wings to the body. You can actually ID to genus, yeah, for a couple of bees just by looking at that. Also, the bands on the abdomen, you can actually count them. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then there's 6. So females have 6, males have 7. You can also distinguish between genus, different genera, by how the hair lays on here, or if it doesn't have hair. Again, you could tell the family of a bee. If this is a female that collects pollen on the underside of her abdomen, like this osmia who has pollen collecting hair here. For the face, again, antennae, you can count the segments. So 13 on this guy. Also the head shape will help you narrow it down. You can also distinguish between male and female. So osmia, like I was saying, have the facial hair. Also, a lot of males have that clippiest facial feature. If you look at the mandibles for osmia, if you want to try it, it's really hard, but you can potentially ID them to species or like eliminate species by actually counting the teeth on an osmia, which is like the little points. So this one has 2 points on each teeth, on each mandible or a tooth. A dorsal view or a view from above, again, the head shape, antennae, but you also want to look at the wings. So the top wings, not the underside wings, or the forewings, I guess. So you want to look at, they're called submarginal cells. So bees either have 2 or 3 submarginal cells, and you can actually ID a bee to genus, some of them subgenus, by just a photo of their wings. And then the posterior, you can tell some males from females. You can see how the hair lies on them as well. It's the way you could distinguish a lot of like halictids parts, so Lasioglossums from halictus. Also, it's a great way to distinguish like Melisotis from like Anthophora or Diadacia, because a lot of those bees look really similar by how the hair lays on the abdomen. Okay, so some equipment. You can just use your cell phone, or you can get like a macro clip-on for your cell phone. And I think these things, you can get them for under $30. Just clip it onto your phone, creates like a macro lens. iPhone has an actual app where you can take raw photos on your camera, and they sell like a lens. I don't know how much that one costs. It looks like it costs more. It's Apple. But you can take really good photos with that. Here's some examples of photos that you can actually take. So this is, again, this is with my Samsung S6. So obviously this was really long time ago. You guys can take better photos now because this was a while ago. But again, you can tell Mega Kylie just with a cell phone. So flashes, I feel like whenever someone wants to get into macro photography, for whatever reason, camera stores always recommend ring lights. I don't know why they recommend ring lights. I think it's the worst flash you can possibly get for macro. The reason is because it creates a round hotspot. So a hotspot is just a white area where there's absolutely no information, and it's a circle. And it's really hard to diffuse that or like soften it so you don't have that. So I always recommend a single flash or dual flashes. Personally, I started out with dual flashes. I absolutely love them, but it got really heavy. So I ended up switching to a single flash. And I have a diffuser I actually bought from someone else with the dual flashes. There's not a lot of diffusers. I had to make one, which ended up working well. But when I switched to a single flash, it dropped about 3 pounds off of my camera, so a lot lighter. So this is what my camera setup looked like with dual flashes. So I actually had arms on both of my cameras. And I had this like little mount here, and then I had soft boxes. And then this is polypropylene. I think it's like 0.3 millimeters. Really, really soft flash, but it worked really, really well. There's a view from the front. Currently, I use Cygnus Tech diffuser, but AK diffusers are also really nice. And just to kind of show you the differences between a photo without a diffuser and with a diffuser. So this is a stacked image, by the way. This is a single image, but this is called a hotspot. So like I was talking about before with the ring light, if this was a ring, it would just be like a ring here instead of just a spot. But with the diffuser, softens it up and just lights the whole B. Also, I feel like it makes it like a little bit more 3D, but maybe just my opinion. So I have two cameras right now. I have a Nikon D500, which is a crop sensor. This is the one that I started out with, and I think crop sensors are great for photographing small things and making them look larger. But now with technology, even like I got this camera in 2018, mirrorless cameras, you can crop things, and I think they have more details than like a crop sensor. And I just think, well, this is the mirrorless that I also have now. I actually take both of these out with me wherever I go. But this is just a fantastic camera. You can also shoot with ISO like crazy high, which I never do because I have a flash. But you can also, if you have a really dark photo, as long as you're shooting raw, you can actually in Lightroom or like Photoshop brighten the photo up a lot. But yeah, two really great cameras. If you're just starting out, I would recommend the D500. This one is discontinued, but you can still actually find it in a lot of places. So yeah, really great cameras. So the lens that I primarily use is the Nikkor 105 f2.8. So I like this one because it has 105 millimeters. So that's the distance between the back of the lens and the subject you're shooting. So a lot of times when you're shooting macro photography, it's like an 80 millimeter or 50 millimeter. So those have a lot less working distance. So I like the 105s because with bees or with like a lot of moving things, they're more likely to fly away from me. So this gives me, again, more working distance. Tamron has a great lens too, which I think if I would have started out again, I probably would have started with this Tamron 90. It's slightly sharper. It does give you less working distance, but great lens. Reverse mount ring. If you already have a camera and you have like a walk around lens already, but you don't want to invest in a macro lens, you can actually get a reverse mount ring for your lens. So you can actually take your lens off. You attach this ring mount to your camera body and you just turn your lens around. So it's kind of like looking through binoculars backwards. So it turns whatever lens that you have in to a macro lens. So really affordable option. A lot of people really like diopters. and extension tubes. Personally, I use diopters, but that's because I shoot with like a 105. So I think anything over 70 millimeter, a diopter is more effective. If you're shooting below, the extension tubes might work better for you. I don't really have a lot of experience with them, but they basically increase the magnification of your subject or get you a lot closer to your subject. But yeah, a lot of people like extension tubes because they don't put extra glass in between you and your subject. So this is my diopter. I use Raynox. So the 105 is for shooting like the entire body of a bee as well as the flower that they're on. So these are some photos that I shot with the 105. So that's a centrist bee coming out of her burrow. This is a queen Bombus melnopygus. Those are again the male bees sleeping on the what I think is aster. This is a 250 Raynox, so this is for closer. And I use this one for smaller subjects. So this is a Lasioglossum ovaliceps, which is another bee that you'll see in your yard. And what's really interesting about this bee is if you try and look up any information about it, the information is that there's not a lot known about this bee. So if you find this bee in your yard and you find like a burrow, you find even like, I've never seen a male even. If you find a male, just like cool things like that, you can maybe make a contribution. Males have been found, but I just haven't seen one. Another close up of a perched bee, the nomada again, Brachymolectica. This is one of my newer lenses. It's a Laowa 15 millimeter. It's a wide angle macro lens. And this is really great lens because it'll give you not just your subject in focus, like a very small thing, but it'll also give you a context shot for where your subject is. So basically, like with this, a lot of times you're shooting basically right up to the lens. So if you're shooting up to the lens, you get the lens dirty a lot. So I always get a lens filter, and these things are like $7. So this is an example of things that I photographed. So this flower is actually almost touching the lens, but it gives you, again, an environmental context shot. Same thing with this bee. It's a Bombus sonoris, which is a vulnerable bumblebee. This was in Madrona Marsh in Torrance, I think. Here's another one. This is when the marsh was dry last year. It's completely flooded now. This is a Diadacia in Nevada in a park. So context. Laowa 25 millimeter. This is an ultra macro lens, 2.5 to 5 times. I use this to shoot anything that's under like 4 to 5 millimeters. A ring light comes with this. Again, I don't recommend the ring light. If you get like Cygnus Tech or IQ diffusers, they have a focus light on there. So this is basically like shooting through a microscope. So you need a focus light on there to use this because everything looks black otherwise. But here's some of the photos I took with this close up on a Lasioglossum dialictus face, the Perdita interrupta. This is the Perdita minima again. Yeah. All right. And then just to get into some of my goals. So I want to photograph the 4 endangered bumblebees in California. I photographed one so far. I made an attempt 2 years ago. Gonna make another attempt in the Sierras in a month. So hopefully I get 2 more bumblebees while I'm up there. I also want to encourage more people to get into community science. So this is an example of what happens if you encourage like your friends or family members to get into community science. So a 4-year-old actually rediscovered some bees that were thought to be no longer in the United States because her aunt actually really loves ecology and would take her out on a lot of hikes. And she saw these bees and she's like, oh, wow, these are really unique. Made a lot of news in 2021, but yeah, these were rediscovered in Palo Alto. So very cool. Also, there's 1,643 recognized species of bees in California. I think it would be great if when people think of bees, they thought of more than just honeybees. Also want to promote and create native landscaping bridges. So for example, my friend Paloma's yard, what happened is she moved and the people who moved in decided to just put in a green lawn. Where would those bees go? So encourage your neighbors to put like a small patch of native landscaping. Also want to finish a coffee table book this year. Hopefully I'm working on it. So we'll see what happens. So release some flashcards, which will be out in like July. So really excited for that. That's a preview of the early version of them. So they don't look like this much anymore. But yeah, it's what I'm working on. And then I want to leave you guys with this video. It's just a screenshot of it, but when you guys have time, go to PBS and check out My Garden of 1,000 Bees. This was a man who had a lot of really nice camera equipment, was a documentary filmmaker, didn't have a lot to do during the pandemic, so he made a really cool documentary about the bees in his yard, and I think everyone should watch it, check it out. It's so entertaining. It's free to watch on PBS. So yeah, thank you so much.